I arrived at the base just as the sun was bleeding out behind the tree line, a wash of sickly orange and red that seemed to burn away the last traces of comfort from the world above. The camp wasn't much, 3 canvas tents pitched in uneven gravel, a battered generator coughing up smoke, and a single floodlight that barely held back the weight of the forest pressing in on all sides. What struck me most, though, was the yawning mouth of the cave, carved into the hillside like a wound in the earth. Even from 50 yards away, I felt it pulling at me, its silence swallowing the chirps of insects and the rustle of wind through the leaves. Sound didn't just die near that entrance, it was consumed. I had been hired as a surveyor. My job was simple enough on paper: chart the underground river that supposedly ran for miles beneath the rock, map its offshoots, and measure the flow. Nothing more, nothing less. The expedition leader, Dr. Halvorsen, had been vague in his correspondence, stressing urgency more than detail. But the pay had been generous, the kind that made me pack my bags without asking too many questions. Now, standing at the edge of the camp with my duffel over one shoulder, I wasn't so sure. The air smelled wrong here, damp and mineral-rich, as if I'd already stepped a few feet underground. Each breath coated my tongue in a taste like rusted iron. "Surveyor," a voice called out. I turned to see a man in his 50s stepping into the light. His face was all sharp angles, shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. A lantern swung in his hand, its flame guttering in the breeze. His posture carried the stiff authority of someone who had long since stopped pretending to be polite. "That's me," I said, trying to sound steadier than I felt. "Halvorsen," he introduced himself curtly, not offering a handshake. "You're late. Orientation started 20 minutes ago." I muttered an apology, but he was already walking, and I followed him down the uneven gravel toward the largest tent. Lanterns flickered along the way, their light struggling against the creeping dusk. The closer we came to the cave mouth, the thicker the air felt, until I could swear the humidity pressed against my skin like damp cloth. Inside the tent, half a dozen others were gathered around a folding table strewn with maps, notebooks, and measuring instruments. Their faces were pale in the lantern glow, drawn with fatigue or something heavier. They barely looked up when I entered, but I felt their eyes slide over me, curious, assessing, and quickly returning to the table. "Everyone," Halvorsen said, his voice cutting through the low murmur of dripping water that seemed to echo from the cave itself, "this is our surveyor. He'll be responsible for mapping the river flow and passageways. He'll also be bound to the same protocols as the rest of us. That is not negotiable." He reached for a thick binder on the table and slid it toward me. The cover was plain, unmarked, except for the word Subterranean Field Protocols stamped in faded ink. The way the others looked at it, then quickly away, made my stomach tighten. "Read it tonight," Halvorsen said. "Memorize it. You'll find that rules down here are not suggestions." The silence after his words felt heavier than the humid air. A drip echoed faintly in the cave mouth outside, but the sound didn't return properly, no crisp reverberation, only a warped, muffled imitation, as though the stone itself had swallowed it and spat back something lesser. I sat at the edge of the table, flipping the binder open just enough to see dense pages of type and numbered lists. My fingers brushed the paper, and it felt oddly rough, like it had absorbed the dampness of the cave over years of handling. I closed it again, unsettled by the intensity of the stares I caught from 2 of the younger researchers. "Your quarters are in the second tent," Halvorsen continued. "Don't wander tonight. The cave has peculiar acoustics. We'll start work at dawn." He dismissed the group with a wave of his hand, and the others drifted out into the night air, their lanterns bobbing like dim stars. I lingered, staring at the binder in front of me, feeling its weight. When I finally stepped outside, the cave mouth loomed larger than ever. The floodlight caught only its outermost curve, leaving the depths in blackness that seemed thicker than shadow. I swear the air was cooler near it, the way a basement always feels compared to the rooms above. I thought I heard something, a faint hiss, like water sliding over stone, but when I strained my ears, the sound was gone, leaving only the throb of the generator behind me. I settled into my tent, unrolling my sleeping bag on the cot provided. The fabric was damp to the touch, not from rain but from the cave's breath seeping into everything. I opened the binder again by lantern light, its pages casting tall, nervous shadows against the canvas walls. The first lines were not scientific, not procedural. They read more like commandments. But I didn't let myself read further, not yet. I snapped it shut, telling myself it could wait until morning. Still, as I lay there, the cave's silence pressed in, swallowing even the sound of my own breath. It was as though the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to do the same. The binder felt heavier than paper had any right to be. Its black cover was swollen from years of damp air, the edges curled, the pages inside spotted with faint mineral stains that had bled into the margins. When I first held it, I thought it might just be a safety manual, emergency evacuation procedures, protocols for mapping, perhaps warnings about the unstable geology. But the expedition leader handed it over with a solemnity that made me hesitate before opening it. He didn't say much, only, read it carefully. Then read it again. I carried it to my cot, a thin stretch of canvas wedged between crates of surveying gear and the humming lantern that spat shadows against the limestone walls. The camp wasn't much, a cluster of tents and supply tables pitched inside a chamber that could have been mistaken for a cathedral if not for the choking dampness. Every sound was reduced to a hushed murmur by the vaulted stone. Even the river, slinking black and silent through the chamber's edge, made less noise than a brook should. I sat down, spine cold from the limestone under me, and opened the binder. The first page was bare except for a title written in uneven, blocky letters, Subterranean Field Protocols. The second page contained the rules. They weren't formatted like instructions in a normal guidebook. There were no diagrams, no bullet points. Just lines of text, centered on the page, each written like a commandment. Never count the shadows in the water. Never drink directly from the river. Never enter a tunnel with no echo. If you hear rushing water behind you, do not turn around. I must have read those 4 lines a dozen times, my pulse quickening with each pass. They didn't feel like advice, they felt like warnings delivered too late. The kind of rules someone only writes down after the cost has already been paid. I thought about asking questions right away, but the camp was quiet. My co-workers, half scientists, half rough laborers, were scattered about in tired silence. Some catalogued samples of mineral formations. Others scribbled in notebooks. A pair of geologists whispered over a lantern, but their voices carried no further than their own ears. It was the strangest quiet I'd ever experienced. Even when someone dropped a tool, the clatter was swallowed almost instantly, devoured by the cavern. I skimmed further into the binder. There was no context, no explanation, only those same 4 rules repeated across multiple pages. Each time, the handwriting seemed slightly different, as if many people had rewritten them over the years. Some entries looked desperate, scrawled fast with ink bleeding at the edges. Others were neat, deliberate, like someone copying them into scripture. The deeper I read, the more the rules stopped feeling like safety notes and started feeling like ritual. Later that evening, we gathered at a long wooden table that had been dragged down piece by piece from the surface. Lanterns were hung along the edges, their flames casting sickly halos against the cave walls. The leader, Dr. Karst, a man with a voice like gravel, stood at the head of the table. He didn't offer a toast or a speech. He simply lifted his hand, and in unison, the others recited the rules aloud. Never count the shadows in the water. Never drink directly from the river. Never enter a tunnel with no echo. If you hear rushing water behind you, do not turn around. Their voices were flat, stripped of melody. The sound of it sent a shiver through me. It was like listening to a congregation pray in a language I'd never heard, yet one weighted with grief. I glanced at the others as they spoke, pale faces lit from below by lanternlight, shadows stretching upward across their foreheads, eyes fixed on the river's black ribbon at the edge of camp. Nobody smiled. Nobody even blinked. When the chant ended, silence reclaimed the chamber. Water dripped in the distance, each droplet echoing faintly before dying out in the dark. I found myself whispering the first rule under my breath, not even aware I was doing it until one of the workers, a woman named Hale, gave me a sharp look and shook her head. "You'll want to take them seriously," she murmured, her voice low enough that it seemed afraid of traveling too far. "They're not just words." I wanted to laugh, to ask if this was some kind of initiation ritual or folklore passed down to spook newcomers. But when I caught the look in her eyes, tired, watchful, ringed with fear, I swallowed my words. That night, when most of the camp had gone to rest, I lay awake listening to the sound of the river. It was a strange, sluggish flow, moving just enough to ripple the lanternlight in thin shards across the ceiling. I tried to trace the shadows dancing above me, but the more I watched, the more I realized they didn't move quite in time with the flames. They wavered slower, heavier, as though the water itself decided how to twist the light. I turned away and squeezed my eyes shut. The first rule echoed in my skull: never count the shadows in the water. But what did that even mean? The first nights were swallowed by routine. Measuring. Sketching. Logging temperatures, depths, and the subtle gradients of rock layers. At first, it was the kind of monotonous work I had been expecting when I accepted the contract: long hours crouched by lanternlight, noting down the contours of stone walls, counting the seconds between drip echoes, and sketching rough cross-sections of the river as it carved its winding body deeper into the cavern. I tried to keep my hands steady while I drew, though the stone beneath me was slick, and every movement sent a chill up through my bones. My pencil scratched against damp paper, smudging when my fingertips brushed it, the humidity soaking through my notebooks as if the cave itself wanted to absorb the record of its secrets. The water was always there, rushing quietly beside us, a sound that became so constant it started to fade into the backdrop of my mind, until, every so often, it would change. A ripple too sharp. A swirl where none should have been. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue. My eyes playing tricks. The dimness of our lanterns flickering against dark water could make anything seem alive. But I wasn't the only one noticing. One of the geologists, Ramirez, a broad-shouldered man with the kind of nervous energy that made him grind his teeth while he worked, began muttering about fish. Not ordinary ones, either. He swore he saw something dart just beneath the surface, pale and slick, but the wrong shape. Too long. Too many fins. I laughed it off, said caves sometimes harbor strange blind species, albino things that adapted to survive in eternal dark. But my explanation didn't ease the way he stared at the water afterward, as if it were listening to him. By the third night, I stopped laughing. While setting lanterns along a stretch of riverbank, I caught sight of a shadow moving against the current. Not floating debris. Not drift. The shadow slid too deliberately, almost like it was stalking. I leaned closer, lantern raised, trying to gauge the trick of light, yet the longer I looked, the more impossible it became to reconcile what I was seeing. The water was flowing right to left. The shadow was moving left to right. My breath caught. When I blinked, the shadow was gone, dissolving back into the ripples like a dream fading on waking. I told myself not to think about it. I buried myself in work, drawing line after line, measuring angles of the riverbank, anything to focus my mind on numbers and not on shapes in the water. Still, the paranoia grew like mold in the damp air. We all noticed how the echoes never seemed to behave. In an ordinary cavern, sound would bounce and scatter, returning warped but still recognizable. Here, our footsteps rang out and came back late, too late, or not at all. Sometimes I'd call to a coworker down the passage, and the reply would take seconds longer than it should have, as if the cavern was deciding whether to let the voice return. That was when Thomas, one of the junior surveyors, muttered something that silenced us all. "The cave breathes," he whispered. We asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head, refusing to elaborate. He wouldn't meet our eyes, only kept staring at the ceiling where condensation swelled like droplets of sweat before falling, plinking into the river with sharp precision. I laughed again, because it was easier than letting the words sink into me. But my laugh sounded thin in that place. Fragile. That night, while lying in my bedroll on the cavern floor, I thought about his words. The cave breathes. And I realized he wasn't wrong. The air moved in cycles, cool drafts pulling through unseen fissures, then stillness heavy enough to smother. Sometimes, in the stillness, I swore I could hear something else beneath the water's constant murmur. Not rushing. Not dripping. Something like a low hum, deep and patient, the sound you hear when you press your ear to someone's chest. I told myself it was my imagination. Fatigue. The tricks of acoustics in deep stone. But when I closed my eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was lying inside something alive, that the cave walls were the ribs of a slumbering beast, and the river was its vein. The work continued. We hung lanterns on outcroppings, marking distances, stretching string lines across uneven paths. Each task felt ordinary, but dread had seeped into the marrow of it, making every scrape of rock, every drip of water, every flicker of light feel sinister. The others started working faster than before, voices quieter, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something listening. Ramirez chewed his lip bloody. Thomas carried a rosary now, clutching it each time he dipped his boots into the stream to measure depths. Even the expedition leader, Stern, seemed more rigid, his instructions clipped, his eyes flicking always toward the river as if checking it for signs of disobedience. For me, it was the shadows. The longer I stayed near the water, the more I noticed them. Not just distortions. Not just tricks of light. Sometimes they would lag, sliding a second too slow compared to the movement above. Sometimes they would stretch longer than a body could cast. Once, when Stern stood across from me, lantern in hand, his shadow stretched on the riverbed beside mine. But his shadow had two heads. I looked up quickly, his profile sharp, single, unbroken. When I looked back down, the second head was gone. I tried to convince myself it was fatigue. A mirage of moving water. But my pulse quickened anyway. Every detail grew sharper, more unbearable. The air clung to my skin, damp and heavy, smelling of wet stone and rust. My ears rang with the constant plink of droplets, falling like ticking clocks. And when silence did settle, it was worse, an oppressive weight that made me strain to hear anything at all, just so I wouldn't feel so small against the void pressing in from all directions. By the end of the week, I was drawing lines on maps with a shaking hand, lantern light trembling across the damp pages, the echo of my own breathing sounding like whispers behind me. And though I hadn't yet broken any rules, I could feel them circling closer, waiting. It happened on the 8th night. The cave had grown colder as we moved deeper along the river, the air damp and metallic, like inhaling from a rusted pipe. Our lanterns sputtered with every draft, their halos barely reaching the ceiling above. I had grown used to the monotony, hours of mapping, measuring, drawing lines on paper, but that night, something in me cracked. The water had been different all evening. Too still in places, too quick in others. Its surface caught the lantern light strangely, not with the soft shimmer of liquid but with a dull, heavy gleam, like oil. I told myself not to look at it for too long. We had been warned in the binder, never count the shadows in the water. But warnings lose their weight over time. Rules start to feel ceremonial, almost superstitious, like knocking on wood or avoiding ladders. I told myself the scientists only wanted to keep us alert, prevent us from dwelling on tricks of light that could unravel sanity in the dark. That was all. I whispered the third aloud without meaning to. The air shifted instantly. The river's current stuttered, like breath held in a massive chest. Then the surface hardened. I watched, frozen, as ripples stilled into glass. The lantern light bounced back sharper than ever, cold and brittle. A frost smell crept through the humid cavern, wrong in this sweltering place. My breath fogged before my face. And then, movement beneath the ice. A skeletal hand pressed flat against the underside of the frozen sheet, pale bones spread wide, tendons clinging in tatters. The fingers twitched once, scraping upward as if searching for purchase. My knees nearly buckled. My throat locked around a scream that refused to come. The spell broke only when Ramirez shoved me hard, snapping the lantern from my grip. The light scattered, glass clinking across rock. In that split second, the water thawed with a hiss, frost melting into steam, the hand dissolving back into current. Ramirez cursed under his breath, gripping my collar, dragging me back from the edge. His face was ashen, eyes wild, his lips trembling around words he didn't say. Stern was shouting, though his voice echoed wrong, fragments doubling back late, too late. I looked back at the river, desperate for proof that it had happened. But the water only gurgled calmly, as though mocking me, its surface disturbed by nothing more than the occasional drip from the ceiling. "Don't ever do that again," Ramirez hissed. His grip loosened, but his hands shook as though he'd been holding on to fire. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My lungs ached, my teeth chattered from that brief unnatural cold. I hugged myself tight, staring at the river as it slid by with all the serenity of a predator hiding its teeth. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I shut my eyes, I saw that skeletal hand, pressing upward, waiting. My bedroll felt damp though it wasn't. The drip of water from the ceiling sounded like knuckles tapping on glass. I tried to steady my breath, but all I could hear was the rule, whispering over and over, "Never count the shadows in the water." Now I understood. It wasn't superstition. It was survival. And I had broken it. The others avoided me the next morning. Stern's orders were brisker, colder. Ramirez wouldn't look me in the eye. Even Thomas, who'd muttered about the cave breathing, crossed himself when I passed him. It was as though my mistake had stained me, marked me with something contagious. I wanted to protest, to say I hadn't meant to, that it wasn't my fault, but deep down, I knew intent didn't matter. The river had noticed me. That was enough. Hours later, while sketching another crude map, I let my eyes drift once more toward the surface. This time, no extra shadows waited. Only the reflection of my own lantern, flickering across black water. Yet the memory of cold lingered in my skin, a reminder that the river wasn't just water. It was watching. Waiting. The first fire I'd seen since arriving at camp burned in a pit of stones near the central chamber. Someone must have hauled wood down piece by piece, because nothing like it grew this far beneath the earth. The flames licked upward in nervous orange tongues, casting long shadows across the cavern walls. For once, the oppressive damp couldn't smother the warmth, though the smoke coiled stubbornly against the ceiling, trapped like everything else here. We gathered in silence. A dozen of us, knees pulled in, shoulders hunched close to the firelight. Beyond the circle, the cave stretched into blackness, swallowing the flickers as quickly as they appeared. It felt like sitting inside a throat, with the river's faint gurgle serving as its pulse. No one spoke at first. We chewed stale bread, swallowed hard gulps from metal canteens, each of us pretending not to notice how frayed we'd become. Faces gaunt, fingernails cracked from the cold stone, eyes carrying more sleeplessness than any of us dared admit. It was Stern who broke the quiet. His voice was low, gravel dragged across stone. "We've all seen things," he said. "We've all lost things. Pretending otherwise doesn't keep us safer." The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. His words hung heavy, unchallenged. Then Ramirez laughed bitterly, the sound too sharp in the cavern. "My cousin," Ramirez said, staring into the flames. "He came here before me. Different expedition, 2 years back. He thought he heard rushing water behind him one night. Said it was like a flood building in the tunnels. He turned." The silence afterward was suffocating. Even the fire seemed to dim. Ramirez's hand tightened on his knee until his knuckles blanched. All they found were his boots. Sitting neat as you please by the riverbank. Like he stepped out of them before walking into the water. A shiver ran through me. My own near mistake with the shadows rose fresh in memory, the skeletal hand pressing against the frozen surface. My stomach nodded. Another voice spoke up, Lena, a geochemist, her face pale beneath soot. I saw something crawl out once. A shadow, dragging itself onto the stone. It was shaped like a man, but thinner, stretched, like smoke had bones. It reached for me, but the lantern light, she stopped, swallowed hard. The light sent it back into the stream. But I still hear it scratching sometimes. The group shifted uneasily. No one questioned her. None of this was dismissed as tricks of exhaustion anymore. We knew better. Stern leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his face hard as chiseled rock. The rules aren't guidelines. They're not warnings. They're containment. His voice caught briefly, like the word tasted wrong. Break them, and the river takes notice. And once it does, he let the thought hang unfinished. The fire crackled, filling the gap. My eyes darted toward the darkness beyond our circle. It looked thicker tonight, swollen with unseen watchers pressing in against the glow. Every now and then, the shadows trembled, as though reacting to the sound of our voices. I finally found my own voice, though it came out hoarse. Why are we really here? Heads turned. A ripple of discomfort passed through the group. Some looked at Stern. Others stared deeper into the fire, unwilling to meet my eyes. We're mapping the river, Stern said flatly. Too quickly. No, I pressed. We're risking our lives, following rules that make no sense unless someone already knew what was down here. Someone wrote those rules after surviving something. Why bring us here at all? The silence stretched again, longer this time. My heart hammered. I thought no one would answer until Lena spoke, voice trembling. Funding, she whispered. This isn't just geology. The government wants something down here. Something they can't control yet. We're test subjects as much as scientists. Stern shot her a look sharp enough to cut, but she didn't flinch. Her hand shook, but her eyes stayed on the flames. Ramirez muttered a prayer under his breath. Another worker crossed himself. The fire snapped, sending a hiss of sparks toward the cavern roof, as though mocking us. I wanted to ask more, to demand the truth laid bare, but the air shifted around us then. The cave exhaled, a long damp breath that made the flames shudder low. From the black beyond the circle, the drip of water changed rhythm, slower, more deliberate, as if counting along to our conversation. Every head turned outward. For a long moment, none of us breathed. Then Stern's voice, barely audible, cut through. Enough. We don't talk further tonight. The walls have ears. The fire burned lower, but no one moved to feed it. We sat in silence, trapped between the glow and the black, each of us carrying secrets the others only guessed at. My own. One evening, while sketching by lanternlight, I ran my fingers along the wall beside me. The stone was warm. Not the stale warmth of trapped air, this was body heat. Faint but undeniable. I snatched my hand back. A fresh drip landed on my wrist, thicker than water, leaving a tacky smear that smelled faintly of iron. Sleep offered no escape. In my dreams, tunnels stretched and twisted, closing like fists around me. Passages curved back in impossible loops, swallowing their own beginnings. I wandered endlessly, map crumbling to dust in my hands, while the sound of shifting stone followed just behind. I woke to find my map scattered across the floor, torn as though by claws. But I knew I had folded it neatly before bed. Ramirez avoided my gaze when I asked. Stern brushed it off, insisting we conserve energy for work. Yet I saw the fear flicker in their eyes, reflected in the dim glow of our last remaining lanterns. The cave was no longer a place we occupied. It was a predator. Watching. Waiting. Closing in 1 inch at a time. And though no one said it aloud, we all felt the same dreadful truth, every step deeper into the river's body was also a step deeper into its hunger. The cave had taught us to respect silence. It wasn't emptiness down here, it was law. The kind of law that pressed against your chest until your heartbeat felt too loud, that made the scrape of your boot echo like a sin. We learned quickly that words carried further than we wanted, bouncing back from walls in strange distortions, as though unseen things repeated them with twisted mouths. So we whispered, when we spoke at all. And when the silence grew too thick, we let it rest, because even whispers felt like invitations. But then one of us forgot. It happened at the end of another brutal day, when the shifting tunnels had forced us to backtrack for hours. Our packs hung heavy, shoulders raw from the straps, tempers frayed to threads. We collapsed into the central chamber, the cavern that had become our fragile anchor, and for once no one spoke. Stern checked the dwindling lantern oil while the rest of us chewed dry rations without taste. That was when O'Connor began to whistle. It was soft at first, the kind of absent-minded tune a man might carry while carving wood on his porch. A few broken notes of some folk melody, rising and falling unevenly. He didn't even seem to realize he was doing it. The sound stabbed through the stillness like a knife. Every head turned. My chest tightened. "Stop," I hissed, harsher than I meant. O'Connor blinked at me, then gave a sheepish grin and shrugged. "Sorry. Habit." The silence closed in tighter after that. We doused most of the lanterns and tried to sleep, though the dripping water seemed to linger in slower intervals, as if the cave itself were listening. I woke to the sound of whistling. It wasn't O'Connor. The tone was wrong. Too steady. Too exact. The melody looped over and over, flawless and cold. It came from deep in the tunnels, carrying on an unnatural current of air. Others stirred, sitting up in their bedrolls. Faces pale in the faint firelight. The sound grew louder, overlapping, more than one whistle now, weaving together in a sick harmony. "Stay put," Stern ordered in a whisper, but the words trembled. The whistling shifted, folding into something worse. Voices. Human voices. At first it was nonsense syllables, warped vowels echoing through unseen chambers. Then they began to shape themselves into words. Familiar words. My name among them. Daniel. I froze. It was my mother's voice. Clear as day, though she had been dead for years. The sound beckoned from a dark tunnel that yawned open beyond the lantern's reach. Every instinct screamed not to move, but my body leaned toward it all the same. I wasn't the only one. One of the younger researchers, Harris, stood, his face slack with wonder. "It's her," he whispered. "It's Anna. She's calling me." Stern reached for him, but Harris shook him off and stumbled toward the sound. The tunnel swallowed him in seconds. His lantern flame vanished like a star extinguished. The whistling cut off. For a moment, silence reclaimed the chamber. Then came Harris's scream. It was short, jagged, cut off in the middle as though someone had crushed the air out of him. The echoes didn't return. Only a wet dragging sound, fading deeper into the echoless tunnel. None of us spoke. We couldn't. Words felt brittle, useless against what had just happened. Stern's jaw clenched, but he didn't call for Harris. He knew it wouldn't matter. The night stretched on, filled with phantom whistles and voices threading through the dark. We huddled close, our lanterns flickering against the press of the cavern, and listened as the cave imitated us, perfected us, and devoured us one sound at a time. By morning, we were smaller. Not just in number. Smaller in will, in courage, in the fragile belief that rules could keep us safe. Because last night had proven something new. The cave didn't just listen. It spoke. Sleep had become a luxury. Every sound carried menace now. The drip of mineral water overhead, the crackle of our dwindling campfire, even the faint rustle of cloth when someone shifted in their bedroll, it all carried the same weight as footsteps in a room that should be empty. I told myself I wouldn't close my eyes that night, but exhaustion pressed down like a lead blanket. I drifted in and out, snatching fragments of uneasy dreams. When I woke, my mouth was dry, my lantern nearly burned to nothing, and most of the camp still slept. Only Stern was awake, crouched near the far wall, sorting through papers by dim light. He didn't see me stir. I caught the glint of metal, the key he carried at his neck, sliding into the lock of the makeshift office he had claimed from an equipment crate and canvas partition. The office no one was ever allowed inside. He slipped through the flap and drew it closed behind him. I sat frozen for a long time, heart hammering. My better judgment screamed to stay put, but curiosity gnawed harder. Harris was gone, O'Connor was shaken into silence, and all of us were clinging to rules without knowing why. What did Stern know that he hadn't told us? When I finally rose, my legs felt hollow, as though the stone beneath me was a rope bridge swaying over nothing. The others didn't stir as I crept across the chamber, boots muffled in the damp grit. The lock was old, scratched, but not complicated. Harris had once shown me how to jimmy one with a chisel and steady pressure, laughing that it was the only useful trick his brother taught him. The memory stung now, but the trick worked. The lock gave with a soft snap. Inside, the air was heavier. Not just stale but oppressive, as though it carried weight. A lantern burned low on the desk, casting papers into a trembling glow. Notes. Maps. Drawings. I pulled one sheet closer. At first I thought it was a crude sketch of the river system, but the longer I stared the less it resembled water. The lines branched and curved with strange symmetry, like arteries. Veins. The network of a living thing. Across the margins, Stern had scrawled phrases in a hurried, slanted hand: circulatory system. Pulses not current. Do not feed it directly. Another page, lists of rules, the same ones we'd been given, but annotated with consequences. Never count the shadow's fixation, freezing, breach. Never drink the water assimilation. No echo tunnels direct channels, invasive. Rushing water behind assimilation vector. Assimilation. The word chilled me more than death ever could. I found photographs next. Black and white, grainy, edges curled with moisture. They showed chambers I hadn't seen yet, vast caverns where the river pooled in black spirals, surfaces rippling though nothing touched them. In some frames, figures stood near the edge, blurred by motion, their faces stretched too long, their shadows lagging behind them. Beneath the stack lay a leather-bound journal, older than the rest. The pages were fragile, covered in a spidery script that wasn't Stern's. I could barely decipher the words, but one phrase repeated often enough to root in my mind: the river is the body. My hands trembled. I turned another page and found a drawing that stole the breath from my lungs. A colossal shape, half seen in swirling ink, something like a heart but segmented, with tendrils sprawling outward like roots or veins. Beneath it, mistake, counting the third shadow, pressed heavy against my chest, unspoken but undeniable. And in that moment, with the fire shrinking, I realized something. It wasn't the rules that scared me anymore. It was the certainty that every one of us would break one eventually. The morning after the fire, camp felt different. The air was heavier, more stagnant, like the cavern itself had listened in on our whispered confessions and was now deciding what to do with us. We rose slowly, moving through our routines as if drugged. Lanterns hissed, boots scraped across wet stone, and the river murmured faintly in the background. I noticed the way everyone avoided meeting one another's eyes. It was as if we had all admitted too much the night before, and the cave punished honesty with a silence we couldn't quite shake off. Elena, one of the junior geologists, was the first to break that silence. She was younger than most of us, eager, always taking meticulous notes. I'd seen her sketch rock formations late into the night, scribbling in a neat, hurried hand as if afraid of forgetting a single detail. That morning, though, her hands trembled. She spilled her tea twice, muttered apologies no one acknowledged. We set out to chart another stretch of the river. The tunnels bent in strange angles, narrowing and widening without logic. Sometimes it felt like the stone had shifted overnight, as though the walls had grown and reformed while we slept. The drip of water echoed like a metronome, setting a steady pace for our march. Elena walked close to me, her lantern swinging wildly with each uneven step. I caught her glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. "You okay?" I whispered, keeping my voice low so Stern wouldn't hear. She shook her head quickly. Her face was pale, lips cracked from the cave's dryness. "Do you hear it?" I paused, listening. At first, nothing but the steady flow of the river, the shuffle of boots, the scrape of gear. But then, yes. A faint sound behind us. Like water rushing, surging, as if a flood had been loosed in the tunnels. "No," I muttered, louder than I meant to. My voice bounced off the walls, returning warped and too quick. "Don't acknowledge it." But Elena's breathing grew ragged. Her eyes widened, pupils swallowing the brown until her gaze looked all black. "It's right behind me," she whispered. The sound grew louder. I swore I felt a gust of cold air at my back, damp and reeking of minerals. My every instinct screamed to turn, to see, but the rules were etched into me now like scars. If you hear rushing water behind you, do not turn around. "Elena," I hissed. "Keep walking." "Don't," she stopped. Froze in place, chest heaving. Tears streamed down her face, catching in the lantern light. "I can't," she sobbed. And before I could stop her, before Stern could bark a command, she spun around. Her scream split the cavern. A high, raw sound that made my teeth ache. The rushing water roared for one instant, impossibly loud, filling every crevice of the tunnel, then silence. When the echo faded, all that remained of Elena were her boots. Still laced. Still standing upright, toes pointed toward the black river. The lantern she carried clattered to the ground, rolling in a slow arc before sputtering out. The dark swallowed the space where she had been. We stood in paralyzed silence. My skin crawled. The air smelled faintly of iron, sharp and metallic, though the river had not risen. No body, no splash, no trail, just boots. Ramirez muttered a curse. Lena turned away, her shoulders shaking. No one dared retrieve the boots. They sat like markers of absence, too heavy with meaning to touch. Stern cleared his throat, though his voice cracked. "We move on." The words didn't make sense. Elena was gone, consumed, erased, and yet Stern's jaw was set like stone. His eyes flicked to the shadows, then back to us. "We can't linger. It draws attention." I wanted to scream at him. To demand we stop, grieve, acknowledge the horror of what just happened. But my tongue felt like clay, useless in my mouth. The rules pressed against me as surely as the cave walls. Survival here meant swallowing every instinct. We walked on. The boots stayed behind. That night, the cavern seemed satisfied. The dripping water slowed, each drop deliberate, echoing through the chamber like the tick of an enormous clock. Our fire burned weak, flames hunched low as though afraid to rise too high. No one spoke. When I finally lay down in my bedroll, the darkness behind my eyelids was worse than the caverns. Every time I blinked, I saw her, Elena frozen in terror, her scream stretching into eternity. I dreamt of rushing water filling the tunnels, swallowing me whole, leaving nothing behind but my boots, neatly placed, waiting for someone else to find. And when I woke, my chest damp with sweat, the drip-drip rhythm of the cave sounded almost like laughter. I woke with a start the next morning, unsure whether I had slept at all. The fire had burned down to pale embers, faint orange glow trembling against the damp cavern walls. For a moment, I thought the dripping had stopped entirely. Then it resumed, but slower than before, like the cave was letting me know it controlled the tempo, not us. We ate in silence, chewing hard rations that tasted of chalk. No one mentioned Elena. Her absence was a hole at the table, but to speak of her would be to admit what the river had taken. Stern issued orders in clipped tones, as if her name had never been in the logbook. When we returned to our mapping work, I noticed it immediately. The tunnel had changed. Where yesterday a wide arch opened toward a sloping descent, today it narrowed into a jagged seam of rock. I pulled out my map, blinking hard. I had drawn the arch myself. Hours of measurements and sketches, carefully done by lantern light, and now, gone. Did anyone else see this? I asked, holding the map up to Ramirez. He squinted, then shook his head. Must have marked it wrong. I didn't. The words came out sharper than intended. Look at the proportions. It's impossible to mistake that opening. Ramirez shrugged, but his hand tightened around the strap of his pack. He didn't believe me, but he didn't want to admit he might have seen it too. We pressed on, but the more we walked, the less the terrain matched my drawings. Passages that had forked cleanly yesterday now curved back into each other like tangled roots. Ceilings dropped lower, forcing us to stoop. In one stretch, the walls seemed to pulse faintly, condensation dripping in long, sticky threads that clung to my hands like cobwebs. By midday, Stern ordered us back to the central chamber. I took out my maps again, spreading them across the stone. Lantern light flickered against the lines, and I saw it clearly, the cavern was shifting under our feet. It's not the maps, I said. My voice cracked, dry from hours of recycled air. The cave is changing. No one responded at first. The silence pressed down, thick and stifling. Then Lena muttered, or we're changing. Maybe we can't trust our eyes anymore. Her words sat in the air like mold. That night, supplies dwindled faster than expected. Rations gone missing, lantern oil lower than it should be. We argued over portions, Stern silencing us with a look. But I noticed his own pack seemed heavier, bulging oddly at the seams. The sense of confinement worsened each hour. The tunnels pressed closer, stone damp and slick like the inside of some enormous throat. When we walked, vibrations rippled faintly through the floor, as though something massive moved far beneath us. I couldn't shake the thought that the river wasn't flowing through the cave at all. It was flowing with it, and the cave itself was alive. You weren't supposed to see this, he said quietly. His voice was flat, resigned. I swallowed, throat sand dry. You knew. All this time. You knew it wasn't just a river. He stepped inside, closed the flap. For a heartbeat, I thought he might strike me. But instead he rubbed his temple, looking older than I'd ever seen him. It isn't a question of knowing, he murmured. It's a question of keeping the others working long enough to matter. What does that mean? He stared at me, then at the papers scattered across the desk. His jaw flexed. It means the rules are not for our safety. Therefore it's. I felt my stomach turn, a slow inversion that left me cold all over. You're saying we're here to keep it contained. He didn't answer, but he didn't have to. The silence between us was louder than any rushing water. Behind the partition, someone stirred, and I panicked. I swept the papers into rough order and slid past Stern, nearly stumbling into the camp's dim glow. No one else had woken. Not yet. But I carried the knowledge with me, buzzing through my veins like poison. The river wasn't a natural wonder. It was a circulatory system. A living, ancient thing. And we were inside it. Every drop of water we mapped, every echo we chased, every rule we clung to, they weren't precautions against danger. They were rituals to keep the organism from noticing us. And if it ever did. I didn't finish the thought. I couldn't. The cave seemed to pulse around me, walls flexing with a rhythm I had ignored until now. The drip of water no longer felt random. It was a heartbeat, steady and slow, echoing through stone. I crawled back to my bedroll, but sleep was impossible. Not after what I had seen. The others stirred awake hours later, oblivious. Stern never told them. He acted as though nothing had happened. But I knew. And from that moment forward, every step deeper into the cave felt like walking through the veins of a sleeping giant, praying it never felt the tickle of our movement. Because if it did, we would not be explorers. We would be blood. It began with a sound. Not the usual drips or distant rumbles we had grown numb to, but a deep, resonant crack that rolled through the cavern like thunder trapped underground. At first, I thought I had dreamed it. The campfire had burned low, casting only feeble light, and I was half asleep against the stone wall. But then the ground shivered beneath me, faint at first, then harder, until cups and lanterns rattled in their places. Someone screamed. The cavern answered. A booming groan tore through the stone, followed by the sharp fracture of rock splitting. Pebbles rained from the ceiling. Then came the rush. Water exploded from a side tunnel, black and furious, sweeping lanterns from their hooks and pitching fire into darkness. The camp erupted into chaos. Figures stumbled, half-lit by swinging flames, shouts overlapping into incoherence. Get the maps. Save the equipment. Move, move. I was knocked sideways by a surge of current that stung like knives. The taste of iron filled my mouth, metallic and bitter. My lantern winked out, plunging me into a suffocating dark where the only constant was the roar of water. Hands clawed at me, someone's, anyone's, but the current tore us apart. I slammed into a stone outcrop, pain ringing through my ribs. My breath went ragged, chest tight, as if the cave itself had squeezed the air from me. Shadows swarmed across the walls. At first I thought they were tricks of the flickering flames, but no, these moved with intention, detaching from their casters and crawling across the rock like oil slicks. They darted upward, clinging to the ceiling, then stretched unnaturally long, skimming over the flood like predators circling prey. Someone shouted my name, their voice ragged. I couldn't tell who. It didn't matter. The shadows were louder, whispering in low tones that rippled through the cavern louder than the river itself. The water surged higher, sweeping bedrolls, crates, and entire tables into its current. I tried to stand but my boots slipped on slick stone. The current yanked me down to my knees. Cold swallowed me to the waist. A lantern shattered against a wall, and for an instant light flared across the chamber. I saw Stern grappling with a supply chest, his face carved in grim determination. Behind him, a junior geologist was swept clean off her feet. She screamed, arms outstretched, before vanishing into the torrent. I lunged forward, instinct overriding thought, but a fresh collapse shook the chamber. A boulder the size of a truck slammed down between us, throwing up a geyser of black spray. I staggered back, coughing. Dust and water mingled into a choking haze. The cave roared as though alive, each collapse echoing like a monstrous growl. The shadows multiplied, dragging along the walls, their limbs bending in impossible directions. One stretched its arm across the flood, a slick black silhouette that brushed against a worker scrambling for safety. The man shrieked and froze mid-motion, body stiffening before the current swallowed him whole. The air grew thick, damp with minerals and mold, every breath tasting of rot. My lungs burned. My hands shook uncontrollably. I crawled onto a higher ledge, barely keeping my footing as water sloshed at my boots. From this vantage I saw the chaos below, half the camp submerged, equipment gone, survivors clinging to stone outcrops like barnacles. Some still screamed. Others were silent, dragged beneath the flood or lost to the shadows. The current carried more than debris. Shapes drifted just beneath the surface, too big for fish, too wrong in form. Their outlines flickered, indistinct, but every so often I caught a glimpse of something resembling a face, stretched long and smooth, sliding by inches from my legs. The cave shuddered again, a grinding groan that felt less like rock breaking and more like a ribcage straining. The realization clawed at me, this wasn't a cave collapsing. It was something larger convulsing, as though the flood was not destruction but breath. Up. Stern's voice carried across the din. He stood on another ledge, waving frantically, his lantern the only steady light left. Get higher. I tried to move, but the current slapped against the stone, nearly pulling me back. My hands scrabbled for purchase. Fingers found a crevice, and I hauled myself upward, muscles burning with the effort. My chest scraped raw against the wall as I dragged myself higher, inch by desperate inch. The roar of water didn't relent. If anything, it grew louder, a crescendo that filled the entire world. The walls seemed to hum with it, vibrating through my bones. Halfway up, I dared to look back. The camp was gone. Only fragments remained, floating wood, torn canvas, the faint glow of drowned lanterns winking out beneath the surface. The shadows still swirled, but now they clung to the water itself, stretching like ink poured into the current, chasing survivors who still thrashed for air. And then, silence. Not complete, not truly, but sudden enough that my ears rang. The water still surged, but its roar dulled. The collapses ceased. The cave held its breath. That was when I realized what I had been hearing beneath the chaos all along, not just the roar of water, but a rhythm, slow and steady, like a monstrous heartbeat echoing through stone. The river wasn't striking randomly. It was pulsing. I clung to the ledge, body trembling, staring into the dark flood below. The shadows drifted lazily now, no longer frantic, as if satisfied. The cavern seemed to settle, stone groaning in a low exhale. All around me, survivors gasped, coughed, clung to any perch they'd found. No one spoke. No one dared. We weren't in control. We never had been. The river had chosen to remind us. And it had done so by taking half of us into its body. The flood left behind more than ruin. By morning, though morning underground was nothing but guesswork, the camp was a graveyard. Tents were shredded. Supplies gone. Half the names I had memorized from the roster were no longer among us. The survivors sat slumped on damp stone, faces hollow, hair plastered with grime and river mud. No one spoke above a whisper, as though raising a voice might summon another collapse. The river had drawn back into its channel, but it hadn't receded entirely. Its edges licked at the rocks like a predator tasting the air. Sometimes ripples darted across its surface without cause, and every one of us turned to watch with dread. That was when we noticed the shadows hadn't left with the water. At first, they clung to the walls just beyond lantern light, faint and sluggish, as if the flood had exhausted them. But as hours bled together, they began to circle closer. No longer did they retreat when lanterns were lifted. Instead, they skirted the glow, bending their forms to avoid direct beams, lingering just long enough to prove they could. "They're adapting," whispered Kieran, one of the field assistants, voice ragged with fear. His knuckles whitened around a lantern pole. "They weren't like this before." None of us answered. We couldn't. That night, the first voice came. It was a whistle at first, a long, trembling note that echoed across the cavern. We all froze. Whistling was forbidden, ever since the last man had broken the silence rule and been dragged away. But the sound persisted, too crisp, too deliberate. Then it shifted. "Mar, I-A," the voice cracked, wet and gurgling, but clear enough. Maria was one of the hydrologists. Her head jerked up, eyes wide, hands trembling over her notebook. "It's my brother," she whispered. "It sounds like him." Before anyone could stop her, she rose to her feet and stepped toward the riverbank. Lantern light followed her, casting jittering reflections across the water. "No." Stern barked, but his voice was drowned by the sound of rushing water that wasn't there a moment ago. We all heard it, an impossible surge, as though a waterfall thundered just behind us. Reflex made me spin halfway before I caught myself, remembering the rule. Never turn if you hear rushing water. My breath caught in my throat. Maria wasn't so careful. She turned. Her scream was short, cut off mid-breath. Her lantern crashed to the ground, glass shattering. By the time Stern lunged forward, there was nothing left of her but a damp impression in the mud. The river had taken her in silence. We barely slept after that. Those of us who did slipped into nightmares. I dreamed of water seeping into my lungs, cold and viscous, filling me like cement. I woke choking, coughing into my sleeve, only to find it damp, clammy, as though I had truly drowned in my sleep. The others confessed the same. One by one, they admitted they too dreamed of the water, of shadows that whispered their names and tugged at their ankles. Every morning, their bedrolls were wet, as if the dreams had been real. The worst part wasn't the dreams. It was the voices. They grew bolder, clearer, almost playful. Stern's name called from one tunnel, then from another, overlapping, taunting him. Sometimes they used the voices of our lost comrades, other times they mimicked our own, thrown back at us like cruel parodies. At one point, I heard myself calling my own name from the riverbank. My lantern nearly slipped from my grip. The shadows danced just beyond the edge of the light, stretching tall and thin, sometimes breaking into fragments that crawled like insects. They no longer flinched when Stern barked orders or when we huddled close. Instead, they lingered, watching, circling, adapting. The walls of the cavern sweated constantly now. Every surface dripped with condensation, thick and slimy, carrying the stench of mold and iron. My skin itched where the moisture touched it, as though the cave itself was leaching into me. Sleep offered no refuge. Each night I awoke slick with cold sweat, convinced something had brushed against me. Once, I swore I felt fingers in my hair, combing through with patient malice. Kieran broke first. We found him muttering in the dark, rocking back and forth beside a guttering lantern. His eyes were wild, bloodshot. "They know us," he whispered. "They're learning. They'll take our words. They'll take our faces. And then no one will tell the difference." He tried to douse the lantern, insisting the light only angered them. Stern tackled him, prying the lantern free, but the damage was done. The shadows pressed closer that night, almost gleeful in their circling. Every pulse of the underground current seemed to sync with my heartbeat. The line between waking and dreaming blurred. Sometimes I'd blink and see the chamber tilt, walls breathing in and out as though I stood inside a chest cavity. One night, I woke with water dripping from my lips. Not sweat, water. Thick, dark droplets that stained my sleeve. My chest ached, lungs heavy. For a moment I was certain I hadn't escaped the flood at all, that I was still drowning, and everything since had been a hallucination carved by the river. The worst part? I wasn't sure that wasn't the truth. The rules had always seemed like strange superstitions, but now they felt like flimsy locks on a door we had already cracked open. We were the experiment, and the cave was learning how best to dismantle us. And the shadows, they weren't afraid anymore. They were waiting.